one of the best ways of bringing home the benefit and value of volunteering in our community would be to organise a day of action and one-day strike for volunteers, and the whole of our public services would collapse overnight. It also has a benefit, a huge value to our community, because it can help to bring communities together, to build a strong and cohesive society, in the jargon that's used at the moment, build social capital. And finally, and probably most importantly of all, and particularly relevant for a political gathering like this, I believe that volunteering has a fundamental role to play in terms of building our democracy. And at a time when trust in political institutions is at an all-time low, and we know that volunteers are more likely to vote than non-volunteers, we know that volunteers are more likely to feel good about the place that they live than people who don't volunteer, and we know that volunteers are more likely to be engaged in a whole range of community organisations than people that don't volunteer. I think volunteering has a fundamental role to play in terms of helping to build a strong and cohesive democracy. So that's why volunteering matters. Secondly, some of the opportunities and challenges that the movement faces at the moment. Picking up on a point that Angela made around increasing government and political interest more generally in volunteering, I think our time has come. I think there's a real recognition, primarily for the reasons I've just outlined in terms of the benefits of volunteering, that volunteering is essential to our community health, and politicians of all political persuasions have finally woken up to that. I like to talk about volunteering as representing the spirit of the age, a recognition that government certainly, but also increasingly a recognition that the markets can't provide all of the solutions in our community, and therefore a huge role for voluntary organisations and for volunteers in terms of providing for community need. So it's our time, and therefore we have to really make the most of it. Also, paradoxically, the recession has, if you can have a good thing coming out of the recession, has been good for volunteering in terms of stimulating demand. The question from Brighton Volunteer Centre, volunteer centres have seen a big increase in numbers of people coming through their doors as a result of the recession. And that link between volunteering and employability, and the role that volunteering can play in terms of helping individuals, but more generally our community as a whole, come out of the recession, I think is important, because it helps to bring volunteering out of the margins and to show that volunteering isn't just an add-on extra, but is something that's absolutely essential to the well-being of our communities. And something that hasn't been mentioned yet, I think if we can get it right, 2012 and the Olympic and Paralympic Games, if we can get it right, and really build on the opportunities that the 70,000 or so volunteers that will be involved in the Games, and the legacy that they can bring if we can inspire a new generation of people through the Games to get involved in their community, I think the Olympics and Paralympic Games has a real opportunity to showcase the importance of volunteering. So those are some of the opportunities. Some of the challenges, well, the recession, of course, is also a huge challenge to volunteer involving organisations and to the infrastructure that supports volunteering. Volunteer centres, we know, are struggling increasingly to survive, just at that time when there is more demand on their services than ever before, and it really is an issue that we need to find a solution to. There's also the issue in relation to the role of volunteers within public services at a time when public spending on public services is being cut. And I do think there's a real issue that if we're not careful, we will go back a generation into some of the bad old debates around job substitution. And we need to avoid that at all costs, because there's nothing more damaging to the future of our movement than to get into a destructive debate around volunteers taking paid work as opposed to adding value and complementing the work that paid professionals can provide in our communities. And therefore we're really pleased to have been working with the TUC over the past few months, and are just on the point of being able to issue some national guidelines governing the relations between paid staff and volunteers, signed up by the TUC, that says unequivocally at the beginning that volunteering is a good thing and brings value to our community, but then goes on to talk about how, in order to unleash that value, we have to be very clear that volunteers are adding value rather than substituting for the work of paid staff. And that's a challenge that we have to embrace over the coming months. And finally, in terms of the challenge, and another issue that's been in the news a lot recently, the issue around the Independent Safeguarding Authority and criminal record checks. And more generally, I think, than that, I think there's a challenge for us within the volunteering movement to find a better balance between regulation and freedom, between risk management and allowing space for our individual citizens, our volunteers, to take well-managed and well-mediated risk. And I do worry that if we're not careful, we'll get to a situation where we wrap volunteering in such a blanket of red tape and regulation that we're going to squeeze out the real spirit that actually lies at the heart of what volunteering is all about. And then finally, just on the role of government, I think government can do more in terms of setting a good example, in terms of encouraging public servants to volunteer, in terms of opening up the public services in the way that Julia Neuberger advocated in her reports to the engagement of volunteers, in complementary, I would add again, rather than in any sense substitute roles. I think government does have to really get to grips with the local infrastructure and how it can support a sustainable volunteer centre infrastructure. That's not to say that central government has to fund it, but I think central government needs to broker better relations and better dialogue with local government, and it's great to have a representative from the LGA here to see how we can begin to get much greater local government buy-in to the central importance of the infrastructure in order to make this great movement of ours work. And finally, and paradoxically, whilst I'm advocating that government has a very strong and central role to play in terms of making volunteering work, I also think it has to know when to stay back and keep out of the debate. And I do worry sometimes that government is getting itself too immersed and too embroiled in volunteering. It needs to set the foundations, it needs to provide the climate in which volunteering can flourish, but it also needs to know when to stand back.